Hello, my name is Matt Olson. I'm an assistant professor at Stockton University in southern New Jersey. Stockton's located about 10 miles or so west of Atlantic City. We're in the eastern edge of the Pine Barrens. And, being located here in the Pine Barrens, we tend to focus a little bit more on our upland pine forest. But for today, my focus here is going to be talking about Atlantic white cedar and really introducing you to a stand where some research has been done in the past. So my predecessor actually in this position initiated a project to look at post-clear cutting stand establishment options for getting stands back on trajectory to basically becoming a dense Atlantic white cedar dominated stand. So we're going to kind of explore that a little bit. I'll introduce the stand itself. We'll see some video on that. I also did this in collaboration with students. So I'm teaching ecological forest management this semester, and I actually kind of empowered the class to work on aspects of the species silvics and silviculture and restoration and that kind of thing. So they're actually, I'll share some of the video that they've put together. I also have an independent studies student right now who is basically working on this specific stand. We're basically revisiting it and just trying to collect data to be able to kind of tell the story of this particular area from its establishment and then various silvicultural treatments out to where we are today, just to basically evaluate the effectiveness of the previous treatments. So I first want to start off just kind of giving you the impression of the Atlantic white cedar stands. If you've never been in Atlantic white cedar, they're really kind of special places. Particularly the very dense cedar stands that develop on wetland sites. In fact, Atlantic white cedar is considered an obligate wetland species in much of its range, particularly here in New Jersey. In fact, that's our New Jersey's only wetland obligate tree species. So here's a video that I want to show you of dense Atlantic white cedar stand. This is a mature stand that's adjacent to the area that we're going to be presenting in this video. And so just to give you some sense of just the high density, like really high numbers of trees per acre, very high basal area that these stands can maintain over time. Okay, and now I would like to present to you some video and some audio that were provided by my class, my ecological forest management class, as one of their projects. And just to fill us in, I guess, as a group on some of the silvics and just some of the general characteristics of Atlantic white cedar for those that may not be as familiar with the species. So without further ado, here's my ecological forest management class. Take it away, guys.
Atlantic white cedar can be found along the Atlantic and Gulf Coast from southern Maine to central Florida and westward to Mississippi. At the time of European settlement, there may have been as many as 500,000 acres of Atlantic white cedar throughout its range. Its swamps help filter and purify water, as well as store floodwaters and mitigate the effects of drought. Its timber is durable, lightweight, and aromatic, so it is commonly used for fencing, decoys, outdoor furniture, and shingles.
Today there are only around 12,000 acres of dense cedar stands remaining in South Jersey, and only 25,000 acres left where cedar is a component of the forest community. Compared to historical records and estimates, only 22% of stands continue to exist today. Atlantic white cedar typically forms dense stands of trees that are usually all the same age or uneven age classes. The density of trees is chiefly determined by the amount of water present on the site, with more hydric sites having far greater proportions of cedar. Due to their dense stand nature, mature cedar swamp stands often have a surprisingly stable microclimate throughout the year. Compared to surrounding ecosystems, Atlantic white cedar forests are highly diverse and provide habitat for a wide range of unique species not found anywhere else, such as high densities of carnivorous pitcher plants. Mature cedar stands also support nearly twice as many birds per unit area compared to surrounding hardwood forests.
The Atlantic white cedar can produce seeds at different ages depending on the kind of forest stand that it's in. In open stands, the Atlantic white cedar can produce cones at 4 or 5 years of age, while in dense stands, the tree can produce anywhere between 10 to 20 years of age. In New Jersey, the seed distribution of the Atlantic white cedar is diverse because of the wide range of weather between the peak distribution months of October and November. Seeds are primarily distributed by wind. Other ways include mammal transportation, streams, rain, and even snow. Under a mature Atlantic white cedar stand, 8 to 9 million seeds per acre are produced and distributed. In New Jersey, the majority of the seeds would be found east of the seed source due to winds primarily coming from the west.
Atlantic white cedar is confined to regions of organic peat overlying sandy subsoil. It is found in poorly drained mineral soils. Seedbeds for ideal germination are rotten wood, peat, and sphagnum moss. Standing water can be present for months throughout the year. Reproduction is successful in dry swamps, but germination and seedling growth requires more moisture. The ideal conditions are a dry surface, a water table deep as 4 to 5 inches in lowland soils. And according to a USDA article called Atlantic White Cedar, Ecology, Restoration, and Management, Atlantic white cedars need fresh water, but saltwater intrusion inhibits reproduction and is causing a problem for their survival.
Hi, I'm Donovan. I'm going to be talking about Atlantic white cedar maximum size, age, and yield while also showcasing some of Stockton's Atlantic white cedar. The geographic range of Atlantic white cedar is from southern Maine to northern Florida. They achieve maximum size in the southern portions of their range. Historically, Atlantic white cedar may have survived to 1,000 years old in its southernmost ranges, but only ever up to 200 years in New Jersey. Currently, 75 to 100-year Atlantic white cedar stands are considered mature in New Jersey. Yield varies with stand age, site quality, and the number and volume of trees. Yield range of 100 years can be from 6,500 to 54,000 board feet per acre depending on site quality.
The successional stage of Atlantic white cedar has been debated for years. Some consider the cedar a subclimax species, meaning the cedar will gradually be replaced by hardwoods in the absence of disturbance. Therefore, in this view, disturbance is necessary to perpetuate the cedar. However, others argue that neither cedar or its competitor, red maple, successfully become established under mature stands, and the mature stands are only being replaced by other hardwoods or cedars after disturbance, in which case disturbance is not necessary and may contribute to hardwood dominance.
There are 4 types of disturbances, which are fire, harvesting, wind throw, and flooding. For fire, it could be either beneficial or detrimental towards the Atlantic white cedar. It depends on the factors of composition of the stand, the amount of variable seed of each species of the forest floor, composition of adjacent stand, depth of the fire burns in the forest floor, and the position of the water table relative to the substrate after the burn. It is important disturbance in controlling cedar stand dynamics. In the right conditions, the fire can help perpetuate the white cedar. Though in recent years, the importance of fire has declined due to change in frequency and an increase in development in fire suppression.
Atlantic white cedars are also susceptible to injury depending on the type of disturbance that they experience. So with fire, they're very susceptible at all ages, and even a light fire can kill them. And following a wildfire, wildlife such as deer and rabbits frequently prevent reestablishment of the cedars by feeding on the saplings. And fires during dry periods consume a lot of the peat required for Atlantic white cedar seed germination, so that also prevents reestablishment. Insects, they don't really have many insect enemies, and they have a couple of fungi, and of those fungi that do disturb them, they only do minimal damage. Wind also has an effect on Atlantic white cedars, so they have a very shallow root system and a weak hold on swamp peat, which means they're very susceptible to withdraw from severe winds. This usually only affects those exposed and not in dense stands, so like the outer perimeter of trees. Animals also can have a big effect on them. So white-tailed deer pose a threat during the winter since they forage through Atlantic white cedar swamps commonly, and small animals can damage them depending on local densities. And beaver dams are also an issue since they can flood and kill the cedars.
Atlantic white cedar propagates well from cuttings, however, shoot growth is slow and are very often browsed by deer. Injured seedlings and saplings typically develop shoots from lateral branches or dormant buds. Although Atlantic white cedars can spread well and saplings can recover well, a mature Atlantic white cedar does not sprout after it's been cut.
Atlantic white cedars require relatively open conditions for adequate establishment. Within this, there are two main types of harvest designs: complete clear cuts, which are used in smaller areas, and strip clear cuts, which are used in larger areas. Factors that should be considered in determining harvest size include landowner objectives, economics, shape, size, age, condition, and species composition of the stand, adequate forest type, susceptibility of adjacent stand to wind throw, soil type and hydrology of the site, equipment available, and access. Successful regeneration is influenced by the size, shape, and orientation of the cut, size, shape, age, condition, and species composition of the previous stand, hydrology of the site, adjacent forest types, and the white-tailed deer population. Regeneration can be facilitated by natural regeneration, the sources of which come from seed banks, adjacent stands, and seed trees, the advantages of which are that it is comparatively inexpensive, technology is not required, and intrinsic genetic diversity of the stand is maintained. If natural fails, artificial regeneration is required, the sources of which include collected seed and forest floor debris. The advantages are the same as natural generation, but disadvantages include that seed viability is highly variable, seed crops vary among seedlots from different swamps and years, Atlantic white cedar seed commonly exhibits delayed germination, and cone collection is often difficult and time-consuming.
Intermediate treatments are also used in Atlantic white cedar management. Cleaning the stand is often necessary to promote healthy growth. Removing sprouts, as well as diseased, rotten, or undesirable trees, helps promote the growth of more cedars. Understories with a heavy shrub cover should also be managed and cleaned as well. Managers must control competing vegetation to ensure the establishment of white cedar. Herbicides can also be employed to reduce hardwood growth. This saves time and reduces the cost of the overall operation. Thinning is highly variable within the Atlantic white cedar forest stand. Thinning of whole trees is discouraged as to not promote hardwood trees from growing in. These trees would then outcompete the Atlantic white cedars. A light thinning to clear overtop trees, as well as the removal of crowns when trees reach a certain height, are methods of thinning which are encouraged. Overall, there is still much unknown about the benefit of thinning on white cedar trees. Many of these practices are still trial and error based.
Protecting Atlantic white cedar regeneration attempts is very important for both young trees and seedlings. Atlantic white cedar is very susceptible to fire damage at all ages. Prevention of fires can be beneficial to protecting any regeneration attempts. Animal damage is another factor that must be considered when attempting to regenerate Atlantic white cedar. In most areas, protecting seedlings from deer is necessary for successful natural regeneration as well as artificial regeneration. This can be done by plastic mesh collars, chemical deer repellent, food patches, and fencing. Atlantic white cedar is generally unaffected by insects or fungi, which makes control measures for these two threats generally unnecessary. Controlling competing vegetation is very important when attempting to regenerate Atlantic white cedar. Initial vegetation control can be accomplished using one of the following techniques: manual removal, mechanical site preparation, burning, and herbicides. One must be very careful when attempting to burn competing vegetation.
Well, first off, I want to thank my class for providing some good background information. Hope everybody else found that informative. And so now it's time to talk about the stand in question, with the real focus of today's virtual tour. And so the site is a 4-hectare area that was treated with silvicultural clear cutting in 1985 with the objective of regenerating a dense Atlantic white cedar stand. And kind of as the class had mentioned, clear cutting is often used for regenerating Atlantic white cedar, especially with the objective of regenerating a dense Atlantic white cedar stand. The Atlantic white cedar is a species that's a seed banking species, and often kind of what we get after a severe stand replacing disturbance in dense cedar dominated forest is basically a dense cedar stand that regenerates in the aftermath of that. So a very pronounced seed bank type response is often what we get from the species. And some research suggests that Atlantic white cedar seed can remain dormant and viable for over a decade, maybe as much as 15 years in the soil seed bank. So it's kind of our principal way of regenerating the species, is really just relying mainly on that seed bank to try to get a dense cedar stand established in the aftermath of a pretty intense overstory removal. And so in this case, the stand was evaluated back in, would have been the early 80s, maybe mid 80s, something around that time, by state foresters. This is on state land. And they had determined that the stand was starting to deteriorate. It was starting to break up. And kind of also, as we learned from the class, is that when you get these really dense stands on these wetland sites, you have shallow rooting and just in muck and organic soils that really don't provide a lot of anchorage. As these stands begin to break up, as they mature, then they really tend to deteriorate and fall apart. And so the decision here was, well, let's basically go out, clear cut the site to try to get a new even age stand of Atlantic white cedar established. And so the study site, just to give you some context here, spatial context, is it's in the New Jersey Pine Barrens. So you can actually see it in this case. I basically have two pins indicated on this map here, so that the northern of the two yellow pins, that's the cedar regeneration study site. And I also put Stockton University on here just for reference. You can see where it is. So it's about, as a crow flies, it's about 40 miles or so from Stockton University, approximately. It's on state land, so it's on Brendan Byrne State Forest. In fact, when the study first got put in, the state forest had a different name. It was Lebanon State Forest. And so the name was changed to Brendan Byrne, which honors former governor of the state of New Jersey, who was very important in getting protections of the New Jersey Pine Barrens. After the site was clear cut, it was, say, 3 to 4 years afterward that state foresters went back out to the regeneration site just to evaluate the status of the Atlantic white cedar. They did their evaluation, and what they found basically was there certainly was a lot of Atlantic white cedar seedling regeneration, but it was just overtopped and not a very competitive position. So they were fearful at that point that the stand was not on trajectory to developing into a dense Atlantic white cedar stand in any kind of a timely manner. So they were concerned enough about that they had decided that they needed to take some corrective action. And so it was about that time that they actually contacted my predecessor to work on testing out some post-clear cutting stand establishment options for Atlantic white cedar. And so my predecessor, Dr. George Zimmerman, he went out with a crew of students, and they, beforehand, as you typically do with good silvicultural research, you want some good pre-treatment data, so they went out and they collected some pre-treatment, some baseline data, and that's what you see here. And kind of what you're looking at here, so this is, again, just for context, this is 5 years after clear cutting, but this is before any type of release or any type of protection type treatments were implemented. In this case, when I say protection, what I'm referring to really is protection from herbivory, from white-tailed deer. So white-tailed deer just can really devour Atlantic white cedar, much like it does with northern white cedar, and can really kind of slow down the development of those stands, or really kind of knock them off trajectory entirely. And so just you can kind of see it in the numbers here. So looking on the left side here, this just shows you kind of the relative breakdown of some of the more important species groups of woody plants coming in. The white bar, that represents Atlantic white cedar, or what I'm just going to keep referring to as AWC. You'll see that that acronym. So that stands for Atlantic white cedar. We have miscellaneous trees, so this is going to be mainly red maple, black gum, pitch pine, maybe some sweet bay magnolia, gray birch, sassafras, some of the other species that tend to regenerate on these sites. And then we have some of the more prominent shrubs. So the heath shrubs in this case, we're looking at high bush blueberry, blue huckleberry. There's various others, Kalmia species and stuff like that. So largely heath shrubs, those would be the heath shrubs. And then we also have, which isn't a heath shrub, is summer sweet or sweet pepper bush. And that's a really, really abundant species out on these sites. And that's it. In fact, that's what we see today in some of the areas that had served as the true controls out, so many years later, it's still heavily dominated by some of these shrubs. It just never really regenerated too successfully back to Atlantic white cedar. So, I mean, you can basically see that very early on, 5 years afterward, the regeneration is largely overtopped by a dense shrub layer. So clearly not the kind of condition that the foresters were pleased with, and a reason for taking corrective action. And so really the justification for this experiment. Okay, so just to go over study design. So again, this is in the aftermath of clear cutting in 1985. By 1990 or so, it was determined that corrective action was needed, and at this time, it wasn't entirely clear what would be the best option at this particular site, or similar sites for that matter, and that's why research had initiated there to really try to figure out kind of what's best for this site, and then perhaps, if we could learn something from that, then maybe we could translate the results to other areas for regeneration success. And so, certainly with the level of competition that we saw before the treatments took place, there was just a very dense shrub layer that was pretty much overtopping a lot of our desirable Atlantic white cedar regeneration. We needed to do something to get rid of that competitive layer. And so the first treatment in this case in 1990, there was an aerial application of arsenal. So it was applied aerially to basically cover about 85 to 90% of the site. And so they actually they put out, it was greenhouse plastic that they actually put down on top of kind of part of the area to protect it from the herbicide. So they basically sprayed the whole area, but they kind of protected under plastic a portion of it that could serve as the true control. So pretty much all the manipulative treatments received an aerial herbicide application at the same time in 1990. And then in 1991, there was a 5-strand electrified wire fence that was erected, and so you can see that here, the yellow checked area. In fact, you can see all the green coming into this image here. That's the area that's within the 5-strand electrified wire fence. And so just from this image, you could probably tell kind of what the long-term story is going to be here. Pretty much where you erect a fence that's going to keep the deer out, that's where you're going to get your best Atlantic white cedar regeneration for the most part. Of course, in areas that have also received herbicide to control competition. And then we also had, as an alternative to using electrified fence, there was another kind of treatment option here, and that was using a chemical deterrent. In this case, they used a chemical deterrent to protect against deer called Hinder. And so that was just to kind of test it as an alternative to erecting some pretty costly fence. Obviously, it costs a lot of money to erect and maintain fences and stuff like that. So just as an alternative option. So the treatments that we have in this case, we have an herbicide and fenced. We have an herbicide only, so we're basically outside of the fence, and then no Hinder applied, just to see what effect just controlling the competition would have. You had the herbicide and then Hinder, so that's the chemical deterrent that was sprayed to inhibit deer. And then finally, they had an untreated portion of that control, where it's really just the effect of the clear cutting that we're seeing play out over time. Okay, so here's an aerial image again of the same study site. This is in 1995, so this would have been 10 years after clear cutting, and then 5 years after implementation of the post-clear cutting stand establishment options of release and then also protection. So just kind of start you here, this is what it would have looked like at that time. And so now we're looking at data collected in 1995, so around that same time that aerial image was shot, probably a little bit earlier in the year. And so just to give you a sense of kind of how things were progressing across the different treatment options within the clear cut. And so this is organized based on size class. So the bottom left is going to be your smallest size class. Immediately above that's your next largest size class. And then finally over to the top and right, that's going to be your largest size class that was characterized at this time. And so in this case, the blue bar, that blue portion of the bar, that represents the Atlantic white cedar. And then the orange is other. And this is just looking at tree reproduction. So we're only looking at the tree component. This does not include shrubs. Just to give you a sense of kind of what the impact of the treatments on the tree community at this stage, and then across size classes. And so what we can see basically is a pretty clear evidence here that the herbicide and fence was after 5 years of this treatment, maintaining this treatment, this was by far the most effective in getting Atlantic white cedar reestablished and really a dense cedar stand going. And kind of how this is oriented here, so we have basically the 4 treatment options, and I kind of have it oriented from left to right to give you some sense of the intensity of the treatment itself, or that you could think of it in terms of management input, so basically increasing from left to right. And so so like with the herbicide and fence, you're going to get your best result in terms of Atlantic white cedar regeneration, but of course that's also the most costly. Then you go to the herbicide and hinder. So again, that's the aerial herbicide, and then this deer deterrent hinder that was sprayed. Certainly there's Atlantic white cedar that's regenerating and advancing into larger size classes, but not nearly the kind of response that you see in the herbicide and fence condition. So deer, in this case, presumably having a bit of a negative effect, depressing the regeneration and preventing it from recruiting into larger size classes, or really just kind of slowing that process. And then you get the herbicide treatment, which, as you can see, it's the herbicide, especially kind of in the small size class, the smallest, and then you get into that intermediate size class. It actually, it's pretty comparable to what you see in the herbicide and hinder, but it isn't until you get to that greater than 1.3 meter size class do you see the real benefit of the hinder treatment in addition to the herbicide, that it's really just kind of giving some of that Atlantic white cedar an advantage of being able to grow above a browse line. We're seeing that happening. And this is 1995, some clear treatment differences. Definitely the herbicide and fence being the most effective of the 3. The herbicide and hinder being not quite as effective, but more effective than the herbicide. And certainly in the controls, we're not seeing really any advancement into the larger size classes beyond the small size class in Atlantic white cedar. It's really it's been eliminated for the most part. So now let's fast forward to 2021, and I would just want to share some video from the 4 different treatment conditions that the 1990 study created, and kind of where we are, in this case, 31 years later. Well, hopefully from those videos you could really see the distinction between those different treatments, 31 years after implementation of release and protection and 36 years after clear cutting. I think in that case the videos really show more than what this data that you see here really illustrates. But and so basically what you're seeing in this case is, in a sense, gives you a sense of what the stocking is of these different areas. Basal area in square meters per hectare, that's on your vertical axis. On your horizontal axis, you have trees per hectare. We don't have stocking guides for Atlantic white cedar, any kind of stocking chart for Atlantic white cedar. We can't really put it in those terms, but I figure in this case we can kind of just use those 2 main structure variables and just kind of basically put all the plots within that space. That's kind of where these plots fall out. So each one of these individual points is a plot that was collected in a different one of those treatment conditions within the clear cut. And so the area that you see, or at least the three plots that are the up pointing triangles, that's for the herbicide and fence. The circles, that's for the herbicide and hinder. The squares, that's the herbicide only, and then the stars, that's the control. So where nothing was done, essentially, just clear cutting only. And so we can kind of see again, I think in a lot of ways what the video had showed. So pretty much very dense cedar stands were generating in the areas that were herbicided and fenced. So that's kind of, I would say, when foresters prescribed clear cutting 1985, kind of what they had in mind was, 3 to 4 decades later, that condition. But then in the other conditions where herbicide was applied, but where you had different types of protection or no protection at all. So in the case of the herbicide and hinder, definitely Atlantic white cedar is your dominant tree coming in as far as the tree community composition goes, but it's a much more open structure, much more irregular stand. There's a lot of open water patches. And actually the same thing goes for the just the herbicide only. In fact, looking at the data here, I see some differences in terms of the amount of Atlantic white cedar and just the overall tree community composition. But they really, when you walk through the areas outside of the fence that were treated with herbicide, they look very, very similar to one another. There really isn't a lot of difference in how they look and how they appear nowadays. And then of course the true control area where it was just clear cutting, nothing else was done. It's just a dense shrub thicket for the most part, with a few Atlantic white cedar that have been able to penetrate that shrub layer. They're just kind of discontinuous layer. But one thing I want to make mention too is that although the desired condition is that dense Atlantic white cedar, there are some benefits, I think, in the areas where it was herbicided, where it is coming back to cedar and cedar dominated, but where it's a more irregular stand structure. And I think in part just the habitat value of that. It's just a different type of stand structure altogether, more of an open stand condition. The birds we were hearing in there were just a little bit different than some of the birds we were hearing in the dense cedar stand. So definitely providing a different kind of habitat there. And not just for wildlife, but then also for the ground flora. So the ground flora in the areas where it was herbicided but outside of the fence, it's really rich. I mean, a whole bunch of wetland plants, obligate wetland species, particularly carnivorous plants, are really abundant in there. And a bunch of other very interesting plants. So a whole bunch of sundews and pitcher plants and stuff like that are growing in those areas that you don't find in the areas where herbicide or protection were implemented. And the true controls, you don't find any of that because of that shrub layer just basically excluding everything. And then on the other end of the spectrum with the herbicide and fenced, it's just very, very dense and not much light making its way into the understory, so you don't really have that rich ground floor that you have in the other areas. So I hope everybody enjoyed this talk and got to see a little bit of New Jersey and our very interesting Atlantic white cedar stands. If you get a chance to come on out here, I highly recommend getting into some of these forests. Just really, really interesting, very cool, and very different from what we have in our typical pine barrens. But anyway, so I hope everybody's doing well, and I look forward to getting back together here, hopefully pretty soon, where we can do this in person.